Hey there, welcome back to the Path to Zion podcast, where we are rediscovering the ancient way. Thank you so much for tuning back into the program today for another audio-only edition. Short and sweet today, too, as we talk about what? Context and identity. Do they matter? I would say that they do, and we're going to discuss for a few brief moments here why. James chapter 1, verse 1, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 will be our primary text, and it will be brief. As I started to read through the book of James just earlier this morning, I was sitting outside on my deck, a beautiful morning, chilly enough to wear a hoodie. It had been raining. We had mowed grass. The birds are singing. The cows are walking around, 50 yards from me. It's just a beautiful day. And as I'm reading through the book of James, I obviously start out James chapter 1, verse 1. Well, verse 1 stood out to me yet again, as it often does. Anytime I read any letters, I stop and take note and remind myself of these 2 points, context and identity. What is the context of the letter, and who is the identity? What is the identity of the author and the intended reader? These 2 things are of utmost importance as we strive to rightly understand the word of Elohim, the Bible, that we have on our desk or on our kitchen table. Hopefully it's not in the trunk of your car. Unless one properly understands who James was addressing in James chapter 1, verse 1 specifically, the entire book will be misunderstood. We can say that again about Shaul Paul's letters that he wrote to whether it's the church of Ephesus or whether it was the church at Philippi or as we're talking about briefly, 1 Peter chapter 1. We have to understand these 2 things, context and identity. So yes, yet again, although brief, we're going to be discussing identity today. And so James chapter 1, verse 1 says this: James, a servant of Elohim and of the Master Messiah, Yeshua. He's identifying himself. He says this, and we'll paraphrase. This letter will be to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And then he says, greetings. By the way, how you doing? And so again, James identifies himself as a servant of Elohim, and he is a servant also of Messiah Yeshua. And he says this is to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And so we have to understand that as we discuss identity, the Council of James was not penned to the Christian church. And now we can say, well, we know he didn't write this, to 2024, Baptist theology, whoever we want to ascribe to and brand these verses applicable to. We have to understand the context. We have to understand the identity of the ones who are receiving this instruction. It was not written to evangelicals. It was not handed to the Catholics or the Protestants or the Charismatics, which we identify here on the program a lot as pretty much being all one and the same. They all swim in the same pool of doctrine with some little tweaks here and there. It was surely not written to the entirety of the world. Like, how many billboards do we see of biblical promises, statements made by prophets or in the Psalms or even just New Testament texts, perhaps something Yeshua, Jesus, said to someone? It's on a billboard, and whoever is driving along the interstate can read it, and the billboard suggests that you can just brand that upon your life. That is not proper context and surely not a proper use of identity of who these things were spoken to and who these promises are for. And so we have to understand this was not a blanket cast out to anyone. It was specifically addressed to the diaspora, okay? The dispersion, the scattered sojourning ones, the ones who were the set aside, set apart, called out holy assembly of Yahweh Elohim in Messiah Yeshua. Okay, that is the assembly that was on the other side of Messiah, was not the new Christian church. That took a couple years to instate. Okay, it took a couple centuries to really get the ball rolling towards this. Oh, let's create a new religion that Jesus kind of, we could say, fathered. He created. But that's, of course, not what Peter or James were talking about when they're writing these letters. As we move along and make this point, 1 Peter chapter 1, as we've alluded to, starts out in the exact same way as James chapter 1 does. As letters always are, the words that these men penned were for a specific people. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. To those who are elect sojourners and exiles of the dispersion. Okay? To the elect sojourners and exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. I mean, these are places that are, of course, named, but the whole point and purpose is to specify the identity of what will be said from here on. Just like James chapter 1, I am a servant of Elohim, a servant of Messiah Yeshua. This is written to the 12 tribes, the diaspora, the dispersed ones, okay? And so we see that James 1, we see that 1 Peter 1, we see that in other places we're not going to mention today for the sake of time. But the counsel that these letters contained was dependent upon many things being rightly understood and in proper place foundationally. Okay? As letters always are, the words that these men penned were for a specific people. Okay, so let's just make this a little more practical as we move along. Imagine, if you will, a letter that you yourself, you sat down and you wrote to your mother or your father, a friend even, someone you've known for 30 years. Okay? It would, of course, contain specific details that very likely they alone would be privy to. Something that they would know the context of what you're sharing. Why? Because of their identity, because of who they were. Okay? The foundation of the relationship would be key to them rightly discerning what it is that the letter that you would write shares. It would be specialized unto them, we could say. Why? In this case, their friends or their family. They would know things that you would reference. They would understand the context that you're speaking from. Why? Because of identity, because of an understanding of who they are and their role of being predisposed, whether about like inheriting an understanding to what you're saying from experience, something that they walked alongside you with, or something they had learned, or something that you reference that they understand because of who they are literally. They understand the foundational context. In light of my example, now give that same letter that you wrote to someone in your close family or a close friend, a brother. But if you hand that letter to someone that has no knowledge of the particulars that was within the letter that you shared, what would happen? One would expect, I say, for the letter's purpose to be entirely misunderstood, entirely misappropriated, mishandled. I believe fully this has been what has happened with letters such as these in James and Peter. In so many biblical authors, Shaul Paul leads the way. As we were even told in the Word, listen, man, Paul is hard to understand. If you're unlearned, if you're unskilled, if you're ignorant, if you do not understand context, if you do not understand identity, you will misappropriate, mishandle, and misapply what Shaul Paul is saying, friends. And that was thousands of years ago. We have fallen prey to the error that we were warned about in the very word that we read, the Bible. So I would say we have misunderstood and misappropriated the words of James that follow chapter 1, verse 1. The words of Peter that follow 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. This is what has happened to so many letters that we think we know, that we think we understand, that are contained within our Bibles. So I want to encourage all of us, whether you're beginning this at step number 1 or if you're years into this, it's an ongoing process. Let us settle this matter of identity. There's no biblical reference of a Christian church now. From the Torah and the prophets to the coming of New Jerusalem, every single thing about it is about a returning of the sojourning ones. Okay? The 12 tribes in the dispersion. Friends, that is who Messiah Yeshua came to reunite and reassemble, to have a one-man, set-apart people for his Father. It's all about the returning of the sojourning ones who are set apart unto the Most High. So, friend, do you know who you are today? Are you a Christian? Are you a Methodist? How do we arrive at a proper understanding of context and identity when we read the Word? And specifically to our text today, when we read these letters that we believe real men penned for real men. Do you know who you are? I hope that you've taken the time to rightly establish a proper foundation of what? Context and identity. Friend, I believe that they matter. You've been listening to the Path to Zion podcast. We are rediscovering the ancient way. Thank you so much for joining us today. Reach out to us via email. pathtozionpodcast@gmail.com is the way to do it. Thank you for listening. We'll be back for more content after this. Amen.